So I want to talk a little bit about migrants and mass migrations. So migration is the history of humankind, but the speed and the size of recent migrations has become one of the defining features of the 21st century, with approximately 69 forcibly displaced people around the world. The challenge posed by mass migrations for governments, humanitarian agencies, and most of all, for the people in host and migrant communities is nothing short of great. Unfortunately, for a lot of these migrants, going back home is not an option. So perhaps the most viable solution for migration is integration. This is one of the solutions that will allow us to have better long-term livelihoods for both migrants and refugees. Unfortunately, we don't really understand very well how people learn to live with each other. A lot of the research that has been done about migrations in the past has been about migrations that have occurred over decades. But those are not the kinds of migrations that I'm talking about. The migrations I'm talking about are the ones that bring millions of people to a new country in a matter of 1 or 2 years. So, of course, if there's 2,000, 3,000, 30,000 people coming in to a new country, the challenge of migration becomes a little bit more complicated. So, in order to study this process of migration in a very fine-grained way, traditional data sources are not enough. Traditional data sources are too sparse, and they don't allow us to get to the level of detail that we need to study integration. So here, what we do is we try to understand integration as a multidimensional process made out of 3 different kinds of integration. First of all, social integration, economic integration, and spatial integration. When I talk about spatial integration, I mean, who do refugees talk to? Do they talk to other refugees? Do they talk to locals? Who are the local bridges between these 2 communities? When I talk about economic integration, we're trying to understand, how do refugees get jobs? Where and how are they working? Are they working at all? What is the probability that a migrant has a full-time job? And when I talk about spatial integration, I talk about, where do migrants live? Where do they work? And where do they spend their time? Are they spread evenly in the city, or are they clustered together in just 1 or 2 neighborhoods? This is the kind of integration that we need to understand. And as I was saying, traditional data sources are too costly. It takes a really long time to be able to collect the data, and they're not scalable. Also, they can't catch up to the speed of the migrations that we've experiencing. So we use mobile phone metadata. Mobile phone metadata, so we can study migration. And why do we use this kinds of data? Because they're low cost, they're being produced anyway, so they're already there. They're scalable because we can get data on entire countries. We can study integration in the ways that I described for every individual in our data set. So they're very, very granular. And they also allow us to preserve the privacy of the users in our database. We only use anonymized data, and we only extract aggregated measures to allow the users to maintain their privacy. So how to best study integration if it's not in the 2 largest migrations that we've seen in recent years, Syria and Venezuela. I'm going to start talking about the Syrian case. So because of the civil war that started in 2011, Syria has produced 6.3 million migrants around the world, of which 3.5 have gone to Turkey. And in Turkey, they have very limited access to work permits, and they're very clustered together around some areas in the country. So we partnered with a local telco that gave us access to approximately 1 million CDRs, which are call data records. And they also gave us access to aggregated cell phone tower traffic for their entire user base. And with that, we were able to measure or quantify the social integration, social integration of migrants to Turkey. So this is the map of Turkey, and the darker areas show us places where migrants are more socially integrated with the local population, and the lighter areas show places where migrants are less integrated with the local population. How do we measure this? We measure this as the percent of calls that migrants make to locals over the total number of calls they make in the 52 weeks that we have in our data set. In order to study spatial integration, we developed two measures. They're different, but they're complementary. One of them is a spatial integration Gini coefficient, which allows us to quantify how evenly spread out migrants are in space. And the second measure is a local encounter index, which allows us to quantify the probability that when a migrant is going about their day, that they'll encounter a local person. And this is important because locals hold information about jobs. Locals hold information about where they can enroll kids to school, about where to have access to certain goods or services. So these two are really important. And what was surprising is that you would think that these two are, the maps will look very similar, but they actually don't. And finally, we're able to study economic integration. So we don't have access to any sort of survey data or demographic information in the data sets that we have, so we have to infer whether migrants are employed or not. So in order to do this, we look at the regularity of the mobility patterns of people. It turns out that people who are employed have a more regular routine than people who are not employed. So when you have a stable job, you get up early in the morning around 7, you get to the office around 9, then you go home around 5, and you go to bed around 10 or 11, right? But if you're unemployed, you don't have this kind of structured routine. So your mobility patterns are a little bit more erratic. And if we measure how regular your mobility pattern is to an ideal, we're able to determine an employment score, which tells us the probability that you have a full-time job. Now I'm going to talk about Venezuela, which is still an ongoing project. The Venezuelan migration crisis is a little bit more recent, actually exploding around 2015. But even though it's more recent, it has already produced 3.6 million migrants, and it is expected that it will produce up to 8 more million migrants by 2021. Most of these migrants have moved to neighboring countries in South America, particularly to Colombia, who has received approximately 2 million migrants in the last 2 years. This is roughly a 4% population increase for Colombia. And 2 million people is about the size of the second largest city in Colombia. Can you imagine having basically your second largest city added to your country in just 2 years? That puts a lot of pressure on all the infrastructure resources, and it really pressures the government to try to figure out the situation. So for Colombia, it is a little bit different than with the Syria context because Colombians and Venezuelans don't have the language barrier that Syrians and Turkish people have. We share a lot of the culture, we share a lot of the history, but for example, Colombia has just come out of a 50-year civil war, which makes the political and social climate in Colombia a little bit tense. So it makes integration with incoming populations a little bit more difficult. Also, Colombia not only serves as the top destination for migrants, it also serves as a gateway for people who want to cross from Venezuela to countries down south. So in addition to the 2 million people we've gotten over the last 2 years, 1 million migrants have used Colombia as a transit to go to countries down south. And these people who come and just are in transit can stay in Colombia anywhere between a couple of weeks to months at a time. But that still takes resources to be able to tend to these people in the amount of time they're in Colombia. And in addition to the context being a little bit different, we also have some technical challenges. So for the data that we had for Turkey, we had the records were tagged. We know if you're a refugee or a local. We don't know much else, but we know that you're a refugee or a local. The data that we got from the telcos in Colombia is not tagged like this. So we have to infer who is a migrant and who is a local just based on the behavior. We also have more data. We have access to 15 million lines over 3 years. And this is very exciting because it means that we can actually study how the process of integration unravels in time, and it can also allow us to do more causal work. Let's see. So, in summary, we have developed new tools to study migrant integration, which is usable in different contexts, and we are able to observe processes that were not observable with previous data sources and previous methods. So I started the talk by saying that migration is the history of humankind. But because of war, because of climate change, and because it is basically the human condition, migration is and will continue to be a fundamental part of humankind. So we have no other option but to learn how we integrate these communities so we can foster a better livelihood for both communities and we can help them come together and build a better future. Thank you.